Hello, RantboxTV. Once again, it is Friday. I'm your host, John Clay. I'm going to be talking with Noomi Spook. Hello, Noomi.
Hello.
Good stuff. How are you doing today?
I'm very well, thank you. Yes, excellent.
Cool, good stuff. We're going to be talking about misogyny in the UK, as it indicates in the title. I want to open this to Noomi. When I say misogyny in the UK, what recent discussions have you had about it and how have they gone?
Yeah, that's a good question. So misogyny in the UK, I mean, obviously the main media attention on misogyny recently has been in relation to the murder of Sarah Everard, the police response to the women at her vigil, and the use of excessive force when dealing with women who were expressing their feelings of, mutual and collective feelings of grief and fear in a way that is natural and very needed, I think. So that level of police response was absolutely ridiculous. Oh, we're being joined by my cat over there. She's like, come to participate in the discussion. And so then that sparked, then obviously that's morphed into people standing up for their rights in the police crime bill. And essentially a lot of the kind of discourse around police brutality has kind of got enmeshed with the discussion around the police crime bill as well, because there've been a string of protests up and down the country, and a similar level of police violence that's been kind of specific. There've been photos specifically of women who have been involved in these protests that have experienced violence at the hands of an over-aggressive police force. So the conversations around that online have been a lot of men kind of hashtagging like, not all men are responsible for murdering women. It's kind of the knee-jerk response of a lot of men who, after women were coming forward, telling men on Twitter, how they could try and make women feel a bit more safe while they're walking around at night. And that kind of response of like, oh, it's not me, is like the least helpful thing to say in a conversation when people are making themselves vulnerable and expressing that that they would, it's a request for help, really, isn't it? It's like, this, I don't feel safe. This is what you could do as the person holding the power in this situation. These are the things that you could do to kind of make me feel a little bit safer. And to go, it's a dismissive, passive aggressive response, really, because it's undermining the experience that the majority of women have had, which is that they have been either, assaulted, they've been catcalled, they've experienced some form of harassment or assault at the hands of a man. So for men to then just go, well, that's not me, is really the last thing that we need in this situation. What we're asking for is a little bit of, we're all fallible human beings. We've all made mistakes and transgressions in a variety of areas in our lives. And, to an extent, that's okay. It's okay to have been, to have said something inappropriate or whatever, because as long as there's a moment of reflection and you go like, okay, yeah, perhaps that's not who I would like to be going forward. And so, maybe I will make some adjustments or apologize for my behavior, and then move forward. Like, let's, we're in this together. So anyway, I just think that, yeah, there's been a lot of like unhelpful and dismissive kind of stances from men online that are doing the classic misogynist thing of positioning their perspective as neutral when it's anything but. It's kind of from the stance of inherent privilege, that's so privileged that they're not able to understand or recognize a worldview that isn't their own, and therefore dismiss it as not being something that exists. They're also not able to see or willing to admit that there is a potential for behavior that is viewed by women or, you know, other kind of oppressed groups, I would say, as being like potentially violent or aggressive behavior, even if it's coming from a benignly, like the intent is benign. That's not how it's received. And so there's a real issue there, which, you know, this kind of like attack as form of defense, and attack from a position that's it's kind of a false neutral. Oh, well, yeah, you're being irrational because, you know, and you're being irrational, you're being hysterical, or you're kind of bringing something to this that doesn't exist, you're blowing it out of proportion, are all kind of statements or positions that undermine the discourse rather than help to contribute or solve the problem. And that's why it's so dangerous, I think, and that's why it needs to be called out, because it isn't a neutral stance. The white male perspective is not a neutral stance. It's a very privileged one. And I don't think there can be a lot of progress until there's recognition of that.
Yeah, there is always going to be a group of people on social media or in real life that when they hear you say the white male's perspective is not a neutral stance, all they hear is you're being horrible to me. They don't understand that you're talking about a structural problem and how that inherently impacts on people's behavior and perspectives. Do you see anything that people can do to contribute to this idea bleeding out of society?
Do I think there's anything that people can do to stop this from bleeding out into society? Well, I think awareness is the first thing. Just applying awareness to your own perspective. So I think this is maybe a good time for me to mention that, you know, I'm very aware that I'm a white, cisgendered, able-bodied woman. So I have an enormous amount of privilege, and I also have a lot to learn and be open and be curious and kind of be humble to learn lessons and be called out on things when I get things wrong. And it takes a certain amount of humility to be able to get to that place, I think. And all I'm asking, I suppose, for people, regardless of where they sit on the gender or race spectrum, to kind of approach the subject of intersectional feminism, I guess, with the same lens of like, I don't know everything, and so let's be open to learning about what other people's perspectives are, because it varies as well. Like there will be other women that have very different views on this to myself, perhaps very different experiences to myself, and their expression is equally as valid, I guess. So I think, yeah, it's just about making yourself aware that your view is not the only one that exists.
Yeah.
And whenever you catch yourself making an assumption about the world, try and figure out where that's coming from, where that perspective is coming from. You know, and I think it helps to like read a lot from personal experiences and testimonies from people who've been through things that you can't possibly experience yourself. So for instance, there's an Instagram account that I follow called Decolonize Yourself, which is all about the experiences of First Nations peoples in the US. It's basically, you know, giving me a perspective that I was totally ignorant of prior to that. And I found it very helpful, actually, and very eye-opening experience in terms of the power of the language that we use to describe certain things. And yeah, I think it's particularly important to listen to perspectives of people and of women who have been silenced, or their voices have not been given much of a platform historically up until this point. I mean, women have been 50% of the population for the entire duration of humanity, and yet where are we in the history books? Where are we? You know, there's just like no mention or very little mention. I mean, things are starting to change now, but in terms of what we were taught in schools, in terms of the contribution of women to society, that perspective has always been missing. And, you know, that's what started the myth of the invisible, neutral, white male perspective, was that we're being taught the perspective of the oppressor as if this is the normal, this is the, you know, and it's only when we start to unlearn some of these things and realize, yeah, but that's only because they took the power, you know, they took power. White men literally stole that from women, from people of color. They don't, you know, it's colonization and patriarchy and capitalism are essentially one and the same thing.
Yeah. And it's all fear-based, isn't it? If people, well, if men back in the day didn't fear their own emotions, or have this jaundiced idea of equating femininity with weakness, or trying to control that perspective, so that was how things like internalized misogyny would begin. If those things didn't happen, then we obviously wouldn't have what we have now. And I'd like to ask you a question based on all that. I mean, in this really strange time where a lot of our relationships will be through the internet, will be parasocial, and there's obviously a big, gigantic, say, potential for radicalization of those who listen to accounts held by Ben Shapiro and Jordan Peterson. How do we de-radicalize the elements of those relationships that we'll have to have in the real world again?
De-radicalization of people. I mean, that's a very complicated.
Yes.
I don't think there's one solution to that. I think it depends on, you know, I mean, in a weird way, it's sort of a form of mental illness, I think, when people get too far down, because, and what I mean by that is that it's a complete identification with a particular ideology.
Yeah.
To the extent where you will defend the ideology to the point where you think that you're defending your own life, because it's almost become inextricably linked from your own identity. So you have, you know, and I think also a lot of the times when people feel connected to a certain ideology, particularly ones on the sort of right of the spectrum, that it's coming from a place of fear, that it's coming from feeling otherized, and feeling like you shouldn't be otherized because you should be the neutral perspective. So if you feel like a pull to identify with a neutral, and then all of a sudden it's like you're being, you know, people are sharing their experiences, which is asking for equality. And that equality now starts to feel like oppression, because, you know, you didn't realize that you were standing on a platform towering above everybody else, and people asking to be raised up to the same level makes you feel like you're being dragged down to their level. Then you're going to go over and join a group that's saying like, that's not fair, that's not right, you should come on board with us. Yeah. And that getting involved in that group is going to kind of galvanize and embolden these ideas. And also we know that the algorithms are sending people in this direction anyway, that is kind of building people up into so the whole radicalization and things online, you know, other than finding things. I mean, there's some great resources out there that sort of explain another perspective, or a kind of unpick some of the ideology. So that, you know, it's really great, actually. There's a new philosophy tube video, and Abigail Thorne is doing an amazing job of kind of unpicking the whole Jordan Peterson ideology. It's a cracking video. I highly recommend people check that out. But also, maybe if you come across anyone online, you could gently point them in the direction of someone like Abigail Thorne or ContraPoints, and just say, here we go, like, have a look at this. This is another perspective. This is, it's not bashing them. It's not calling them any names. It's just kind of explaining from a philosophical point of view where their argument is coming from.
Sure.
And so that kind of stuff is very helpful, I think, but then there are some people who are too far gone, or they're not, you know, there's a level of participation that's required in the de-radicalization process.
Yeah.
And if that person is not ready to go on that journey, then you're going to be wasting your breath. And so I think actually the most important thing that we could do to participate actively in de-radicalization is to work on ourselves and make sure that we are holding ourselves accountable for our own prejudice, and ensuring that we're doing the most that we can to continue to be learning, and also try and meet people on a level that they can understand when we do have these conversations. So it's very hard to remain emotionally detached in conversations about issues that directly affect you. And sometimes it's not, you have to have a boundary, and you have to protect yourself as your first priority. So, you know, that's fine if you're not able to have a conversation with someone in order to kind of de-escalate, or kind of attempt to kind of bring them around from a kind of potentially harmful perspective that they've got. Fine, step away.
There needs to be more awareness that you're having to go through that internally. You know, these guys that are going to mansplain this shit to you need to understand that you are going through that because you can't detach yourself from these experiences. They've partly informed who you are and how you relate to men in various different contexts, whether it be, you know, in a place of vulnerability when you're, like, say, walking home, as, you know, we've seen can, you know, lead to, and has, and unfortunately will lead to many circumstances like we've had recently with Miss Everard. So there needs to be more awareness of that, you know.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, well, hopefully stuff like this conversation, you know, I mean, if people are watching this and feeling like unsure about their behavior, whether or not they're kind of hopefully not in a space where they feel attacked, but maybe just thinking, oh, I wonder if this thing that I've said online or whatever was maybe the perspective of that was maybe read in a different way than I meant it, or maybe I jumped into a conversation too quickly rather than kind of taking a step back and sort of listening to what was being said first. There's a tendency, I think, in terms of the culture of male behavior. So I want to be careful. I'm not saying anything about the biology here. Like, I don't think there is a specific difference between men and women biologically, but I think socially, well, other than, you know, like, and in terms of a significant one, that I don't think there's any such thing as a male or female brain, for instance. Like, I don't think that's a thing. But I feel like the way that men are socialized, shall we say, is in a different way to women. And I think that that's obvious when you look at the, you know, generally speaking. So I work in film and TV, and the majority of women that I work with, or the majority of women that I know in my life, the prevailing issue that they have with their work is a lack of confidence. That's not a coincidence. That's a direct result of living within a society and a system and an industry that prioritizes the male perspective and champions people who have a emboldened belief that they can achieve or do whatever they want. And I think this is a kind of learned behavior that starts from babies onwards. The way that we treat male babies and female babies is very different. And I think that then contributes to the way that men and women behave as adults. And I think that this whole there are two kinds of misogyny. There's like the overt misogyny of like men incels basically who or people like murdering women or deliberately hating women. That's that. And then you've got the less overt, the kind of it's kind of more pervasive in a way, misogyny it's rampant, but it's coming from a benign place, which is that society as a whole has taught us to believe that women are inferior, and by inferior I mean like weaker, softer, gentler, kinder, more compassionate, and it's as a result of that belief that we have been socialized and conditioned to believe that we are also that, so that when we want to stand up for ourselves, when we want to assert our boundaries or assert our authority, we're bossy, or we're a ball buster, or we have these very gendered terms that would not be applied to a man in the same situation. Yeah. And also so anything that goes against the grain of those inherent and not really spoken about social norms about gender are then seen as, but again, also, I feel that I just want to flag at this point that I know that I'm talking about gender in very binary terms here, and that I do not believe that it is. I think that gender appears on a spectrum, and I do not want to cast myself as an expert in any way about the whole spectrum of gender and how it's experienced by trans women, for instance, or non-binary people, because I think that their experiences within this space are also incredibly valuable. And so I can only speak to my experience as a cisgendered woman, but I am not attempting to erase as part of this discussion. I think that it's incredibly important to for me to learn more about those perspectives so that I can add them into the conversations that I have about gender. But
yeah, I mean, your caveat is quite telling, because essentially I agree with you, like we can't afford to have that erasure, but a lot of the time we are talking about a media and the commodities within that media that don't recognize that spectrum. And so the people that imbibe that simulacra or hyper reality of that binary perspective, they'll be living out lives that are conducive to that being the only reality. I mean, we spoke off camera about that. Essentially, we've got people who aren't necessarily being people, not to go full Philip K. Dick on this, but essentially you've got replicants walking around that consider their reality to be the only one. And to that point, I want to come back on an earlier question, but from another perspective. When you rejoin like people in the real world again, outside of like the wonderful world, which is Facebook and Instagram, when you're talking to your friends who have gone quite very far to the left due to a certain kind of radicalization, how do you intend to talk with them about, say, issues of misogyny in the UK? Or do you believe there isn't anything to be said?
No, I definitely think there's always conversations to be had. We're not there yet. We've not reached this kind of utopian goal of Yeah. So no, there's definitely still conversations to be had, and I think that there are definitely conversations to be had on the left as well. That I think that that misogyny exists everywhere in every aspect of society, and it exists in ways that you don't expect, and in places, and that's probably where it's the most, or it's equally damaging, I would say, as because it's a consistent and constant undermining of anything other than the white male perspective. So it's it has to be challenged, and we have to watch out for things like who are the figureheads of the movements that we're putting forward? Is there constantly a decision to have a white man leading the charge for socialist movements or for environmental movements or any kind of movements on the left that are doing good work? But it's like, to what extent is this an intersectional approach? There is a lot to be learned from. Now, just to go back a little bit, when I'm talking about the socialization of women and this idea, this notion that we are more empathetic or kind, in a lot of cases that could be true, because we have been socialized that way, even if it's not a kind of inherent biological disposition for women to behave a certain way. I think that's dangerous to assume that, and I think that's a root cause of a lot of misogynist thinking, is that women are inherently biologically different in ways that mean that they aren't able to, you know, do military service, or, I mean, that's probably a very bad example. I'm not sure to what extent I would ever advocate for that. But you know, I can't think. Just any job that's traditionally seen as a masculine role in society, maybe a leader or something like that. So anyway, but there is a lot to be learned from having a more holistic and horizontalist approach to working, which is something that I've seen in a lot of female-only spaces, where there is an approach that takes into account people's feelings, and we're able to have discussions about those things in a way that informs how the decision-making process is kind of tackled. So there are things that I think are really wonderful, and that society would benefit greatly from learning from the way that the female perspective, whether that's a learned perspective or not, is kind of irrelevant. I feel like there is a something to be said for that, and I think that also in a perfect world, in a genuinely neutral world, the way that we approach decision making, for instance, I know that's a very broad term, but the way that we approach decision making in any capacity would ideally take a little bit from the structures that exist now, which is exclusively from the male patriarchal perspective, and then take some of the learnings that have come from the way that is more traditionally a feminine approach to things, and combine them. And then what you end up with is a neutral ground. I mean, in an ideal world, that would be the best way of doing it, that we're no longer talking about things in gendered terms, that things are genuinely and authentically neutral space, and that masculine and feminine are terms that could potentially go in the bin, that we no longer need this binary sort of distinction, and that that we're able to get to a space of authentic neutrality that is coming from a place of wanting to be supporting growth and I mean personal growth, not like growth in the sort of like GDP way.
No, totally understand that. I think you actually were on the right track. Like, you seem to be like editing yourself regarding women in the military, because we both belong to a film group, Empire, yeah, which they've got an actual subgroup, which is looking at films through a feminist lens. And the subject of G.I. Jane came up. And you could, I don't know if you remember, but you can see the way that Hollywood treated that film and the way that Demi Moore bulked up for that film, and how the reaction to that betrayed so much misogyny, not just in the film world, but how we expect these people to be, you know, in terms of we seem to only think of characters that are played by Demi Moore as being powerful as much as they look a certain way, right? And she's just one example, but G.I. Jane, I think fundamentally, you know, is a great, say, example of what you're talking about.
Well, it's a very complicated issue because, so obviously there are issues around how women are treated in the workplace, and women are treated differently from men. And I think at the core, that's what that film is about, because her character is demonstrating that she is capable of doing anything that a man could do physically. And, you know, there is a lot to be said for a film that's like championing that perspective. And it's also got a lot of other issues of misogyny where they're making her out to be a lesbian, and that would then kind of eradicate her from her capacity to be in the military because, you know, homophobia. So, you know, and so there's a whole other issue there about queer people being denied access to heterosexual spaces and all that stuff, and then also sexual abuse within the military, and there's a lot going on there.
We have to discuss that entire film at some point.
We probably do, but just to kind of zoom out a little bit, there is a wider conversation to be had about the feminist perspective on the military as a whole, and whether or not it could ever be deemed a feminist pursuit to go into a career that is fundamentally about violence, and whether or not there is I mean, I don't really feel equipped to kind of go into this at any length, but I'm aware that there are a lot of really great and articulate feminist thinkers that have done and written some really wonderfully profound pieces about why it's not possible to be a feminist and to hold a view that the military industrial complex is something that I would like to serve as a human being. That there are definitely arguments out there about why those two things are mutually exclusive.
So let me know once this video is done. Let's just pretend we're
it out.
Now. Yeah, it's in the description box now, guys. In the description box now.
Yeah, definitely worth some further reading on that, and because it's a very complicated thing, and it may even be Angela Davis. I'll have a look and I'll see what where I can find that, and yeah, it'll be good to kind of think about that, because there are some. Ultimately, there's a lot to be said that the feminist movement is inextricably linked to the anti-capitalist movement and to the prison abolition movement and to the, essentially it's all the same fight. Like whatever we're fighting, basically, I think it always comes back to the same thing, that, you know, the systems that oppress us are all fundamentally driven by the same thing. And we sort of need to tackle that unilaterally. So I'm not sure how it is obviously helpful to divide the discussion up so that we're able to have a nuanced conversation about the different varying experiences. But I think where that leads itself open to potential for undermining itself is when the discussions become too siloed to the point where it allows people to become totally identified with that this affects me. I'm just interested in white feminism, for instance, because I only want to support a cause that directly affects me, and or that's where I think that's where kind of TERFism comes from as well, in terms of like we're excluding trans women and non-binary people from the discussion about gender because I need to service my needs. This is about me getting, and you know, obviously that people are going to be not viewing it like that because they can't. They're totally identified with their own ideology to the point where everything else is a threat. So you can see it online, the vitriol from people within these kind of siloed feminist groups. And sadly, it is a lot of white women as well who are kind of, you know, leading the charge in terms of these like really, and it's getting to sort of right wing kind of territory, a lot of it as well, which is like,
yeah.
You know,
do you find you're becoming less surprised by the perpetrators of such?
less surprised.
Yeah, like I mean, do we find like awe, shock, and horror when we see like a pattern? Because I don't know, I'm starting to believe that there's a lot of merit in not being as surprised. Do you know what I mean? Which sounds quite cynical, but
I mean, yeah, I think it's not surprising when you think that all of this stuff is coming from the same place. Like if you're an incel and you're totally involved in that community and you've totally identified yourself with that ideology to the point where you would be willing to fight tooth and nail to defend that, and you are not willing to look at anybody else's perspective, and you will, you know, be violent, verbally aggressive, what, you know, really nasty in you towards other people in your defense of that ideology. How is that different to a TERF and their behavior towards anyone who is not a white woman? You know, they're coming from a place of I've been oppressed, and so I want to defend my spaces for white women. How is that different from a man saying, I'm being oppressed and I want to defend my spaces for white men because we're being attacked by the woke brigade or whatever?
Where is this woke brigade? It sounds like a fucking awesome party.
Yeah, no, right? It's like, so I think the trick is because we're all capable, I suppose, of becoming totally identified with a particular ideological position of thought.
Yeah.
And we can apply that to literally any subject, really. But it's particularly like dangerous or frightening, I suppose, when your ideological position is one based on fear of having your rights taken away or having your voice or identity erased. So I think that if we're approaching the subjects of our ideology with curiosity, what can I learn from other people's perspectives on gender, on race, on how those things intersect, on disability and gender? There's so many perspectives that we can learn from. If we're approaching it from that, or you know, on gender as a spectrum, what can I learn? What can I learn about this other person's perspective? You know, if someone who was a, you know, second wave or third wave feminist, okay, with all the waves, but you know, someone who's a kind of 1970s feminist, the kind of Germaine Greers of the world, who, you know, did do a lot for women's rights back in the day. This is the thing, like I find her views on trans women abhorrent, like absolutely disgusting, but she did say a lot of relevant things that in terms of the diminishment of women she's done a lot of work in that area. She's just kind of undermined herself by being closed off and not being willing to carry the conversation on into the present day. You know, she's identified herself with a particular ideology and she stayed where she was. If she'd have been a bit more progressive, she could have learned how to enmesh the changing views around gender with an ideology that would be better able to support women and other people who experience patriarchal oppression. It would have been a lot easier to kind of bring her views up into the modern day. But instead, there's been a silo created around this notion that trans women don't exist and that their experience, their viewpoint is not valid. So yeah, we've ended up with this this rather unpleasant and deeply entrenched ideology that is quite radicalized. And I would hold a mirror up to that and say, how are you different from Ben Shapiro?
Yeah,
you know, the specifics of your argument are different, but your behavior is the same. You know, like how, I suppose this is the other thing, is that people blindly behave in these ways without realizing that they're doing that, and that they're, you know, it's your behavior almost more than your ideology is probably more important. You know, if you you might have quite mild political leanings and not really be very politically aware and just kind of going around. But if your behavior is one that's coming from a place of compassion and curiosity, then you're more likely to be of service to the destruction of the patriarchal oppression than if you are someone who is deeply entrenched, but then weaponizing your ideology in a way that means that your behavior is contributing to the deepening of divides between people who should be united. You know, it's the same fight. Ideologically, they're against the same oppressor, and yet this infighting is well, I want to be careful because I'm making it sound like the trans people are somewhat culpable in this. They're not. There is no two-way street here. The TERFs are kind of, you know, a hate group.
No, it's really about the idea of the megaphone. If you look at what Germaine Greer has done before and all the apologists that are ready to line up and say, well, she's done all this, so therefore what she's saying now, let's understand that. It's the same thing that you'd have with, say, Martina Navratilova. They both become megaphones that are useful for the way that things are now in terms of not doing enough to understand the various different parts of the trans community, because it's like the Black community. Even the idea of saying that is like a simplified term for us to get to a certain point, but even in doing so, we have a kind of indirect erasure of all the different perspectives within that community, you know. So there's that to be taken into regard. Before we end, because I want to know your views on this, because you have so much to say, it's beautiful. When I say internalized misogyny in the UK, what do you think of? What perspective do you have to bring to that element of this discussion?
Internalized misogyny. I mean, it's a daily struggle, I think, for all women to overcome and unlearn the things that we've been taught about ourselves that are unhelpful. So one thing that I think that the next generation of women are getting better at is establishing and setting healthy boundaries. I think that's one thing that is something that we're taught a lot to not do as women. So don't speak up, don't cause a fuss, don't make, you know, also being forced to share our personal space as children is something, you know, oh, go and give this uncle a kiss or a cuddle or whatever. And it's not something that you would necessarily force a boy to do, perhaps. Maybe that's changing, but certainly when I was growing up, there was a lot of like, don't walk around with your top off when you're 9, and you know, because you're that's not ladylike or whatever. So any of the kind of like rambunctious or non-gender specific behavior that comes from a child that is then gendered by the caregiver and placed in a either positive or neutral light. So don't behave like that, don't do that, stop doing that, about playing with mud, or, you know, climbing trees, or being interested in science, or like, there's other things. There's a really, really fascinating little video, which I'll also pull the link up, of like babies in a creche. And there are caregivers who are employees of this, nursery school assistants. And they're given these 2 babies that are in the opposite, they're presenting them in the clothes that are stereotypical of the gender that they are not, or that they've been assigned. It's probably a better way of saying it. So like the boy baby is in a frock, and the girl baby is in little dungarees or whatever, and they're put in this little creche, and they've got hidden cameras on, and they film how the nursery assistants deal with them. So the one in the dungarees is being like put on the horse thing and going like, go ride the thing, and like they're bringing in the cars and stuff like that. And then the girl baby that's dressed as a girl but is really a boy is being given the little ironing board and the doll and stuff. And then they show it to the nursery assistants after, and reveal that they're not actually the genders that the babies weren't the genders that they thought. And it's the first time that the nursery assistants can see for themselves the difference in their behavior towards the children, simply based on the gender that they believed that they were. As soon as you're aware that that's the level, that's how early it starts, and that's the level of difference from like the majority of society, then you can start to see why that behavior then might be manifested in how we as women behave in society. So in terms of feeling like we need to protect ourselves, that we're fragile, that we're frail, that we mustn't mustn't stand up for ourselves, mustn't like make too much of a peep. We want to like put our head down and just kind of, hope that the bully who keeps twanging our bra straps in the middle of like chemistry class is going to get bored and move on, rather than us calling them out, because like that's just how we've been socialized to behave, is to put the needs of others and other people's comfort ahead of our own. So that is a massive thing that we need to unlearn. The second thing, I think, is the whole thing about physical appearance, and like how the emphasis that's placed on women's physical appearance being her primary value that's added to the world. Now, again, this is slowly changing, but I mean, I could speak for hours as to the representation, the sexist representation of women in cinema, just as one example. That's not even looking at advertising or the absolute cascade of images that we see of women's bodies in our phone screens and in adverts online, in the TV, on billboards, just constantly using sexualized images of women's bodies to sell whatever it is, that sends a very clear message to women. I mean, even things like the plots of Disney movies that are all about women getting a guy and living happily ever after, the kind of Disney princess stereotype, is something that is just rammed in there from such an early age. You got that on top of being told, without saying anything, you're told by your caregivers what your limitations are by the way that they guide you towards certain toys rather than others. We've got all that to kind of unlearn and unpick, but the damaging thing that it does to our psyche is that we start to believe that unless we are beautiful and unless we are desired by the male gaze, then we are valueless, and we are not making, or the very limited power that we have, because ultimately, if we want any power in this world, then one of the ways, the only significant way that we can get it is by being attractive, or by utilizing our physical appearance as a way, as leverage towards getting what we want, you know. And that's a really difficult thing to kind of deal with, especially if, you know, your perception of yourself comes off short when you measure yourself up against other women who are achieving that goal to a higher standard than you believe that you are. You know, oh, she's got a thigh gap or whatever. I can't compete with her beautiful complexion or her youth. Her youth is the other thing as well. Like, women get to a certain age and all of a sudden we're not attractive or useful anymore. And it's like, and then that's not even to take into account women who are living with a variety of disabilities. I mean, what does it say about, you know, it's just so egregious. I can't even begin to. And then the trap that you fall into as a feminist is that you start to then beat your, so you inherently care about what you look like, because you're told all the time that that's the most important asset that you have. So, but then as you unlearn that, you begin to become aware of how much you care about that, and how that maybe that's a distraction, and that if you didn't spend an hour a day doing your hair and makeup, you might actually be able to apply that time to whatever it is that you're actually interested in doing with your life. So that in itself creates a gap of time and of labor that is invested into a vapid area of life needlessly. So if it was possible to put that in the bin, The Beauty Myth is a really great book on this subject. If that time was able to be invested somewhere else, then that would be great. That would be a great tool for women. But the problem is that you could realize that, and then you start weaponizing your own discomfort against yourself, because you're like, there's this brilliant picture that I've saved somewhere on my desktop. It was like an image of a woman in tights with like a fat roll, and then she's squeezing her own fat roll, and she's saying, I want to be pretty, but more than anything, I want to not want to be pretty. So it's like, you know, hating yourself for hating yourself is like another layer of internalized misogyny on top of internalized misogyny. It's like, you know, stop being so vapid, stop caring about this. It's not, you know, it's like, we can't, there's, all of these things need to be approached with a level of kindness and compassion for yourself. It's not our fault that we've been raised in a world that's told us all this bullshit. And it's also okay to want to wear makeup. It's okay to want to do all these things. I think ultimately, at the end of the day, feminism should be about choice and freedom of choice, and equality, like that choice being made from a place of equality and not fear. So not feeling like you have to spend an hour a day doing your makeup, otherwise no one's going to take you seriously. And at the same time, it shouldn't be about shaming women who want to express themselves by wearing glittery eyeshadow or whatever. It doesn't mean that you're, you know, if you like the color pink, it doesn't mean that you're a shit feminist. It's like, it's all this stuff. And then there's another layer to internalized misogyny, which I think it would be remiss of me not to mention, which is that women hating other women, or women separating themselves from other women and being like, yeah, but I'm not like most women. You know, there is a, and I admit I was a bit like that when I was growing up, because that was how my internalized misogyny manifested itself, because I didn't want to be associated with the kind of girly girls who were liking pink and, you know, doing all this stuff. Like, I wanted to be in with the guys, or be treated like one of the guys. And so I acted like one of the guys. And I thought that that was like a way of making myself exempt, of their misogyny. I mean, this wasn't a conscious process. I was doing it, you know, it's like one of those things like, oh, you're not like other girls, you're smart or you're interesting or whatever. And like those kind of comments that come is so deeply misogynist, because it's a way of saying that, generally speaking, women are a bit shit and that you're the exception to that rule. And if you're buying into that, you're actually, it's a traitorous position, really. It's like, I say that with compassion. I don't think it's a deliberately, that's a very strong word. I retract that, not traitorous. It's like, you're unconsciously contributing to your own oppression by taking that standpoint, because it's in every woman's interest for all women to be free of this kind of level of you know, patriarchal oppression, I guess.
Yeah.
And then one other thing as well, which is about the child rearing, unpaid labor in the home. I think that also this is something that is really deeply ingrained, and women feel like, oh, I'm so lucky my husband helps with the childcare, or I'm so lucky that my husband like helps me with the ironing or whatever. And it's like, can we please move past this notion that having equal responsibilities in the home, whether that's in raising a child or kind of doing the housework, is women's work, and that this that we should be grateful and bending over backwards for being with a man that acknowledges the inequality and disparity to which this labor is usually distributed. You know, I don't think it's like, no one deserves no blokes out there who kind of like raise their own children in a fair way deserve a badge or something. No, it's like all of this stuff needs to go in the bin. I don't think that the kind of genuine societal equilibrium in this level is ever going to be reached until there is a kind of more Icelandic model of like child like parental leave, for instance. You know, the gender pay gap exists because women need to take time off to give birth, and you know, they're not given jobs and stuff in case they have kids. You know, all of that stuff needs to go in the bin, and one way of addressing it would be to just give men equal time off for a baby. They get 9 months off as well, and if that was the case, then you'd suddenly stop having a preference for employing a certain gender over another, or promoting a certain gender over another. And also it would value the father's role in the upbringing of their child. I mean, that's one of the nice things that's come from the whole lockdown and pandemic situation, is that a lot of people have been at home, and fathers are actually getting to spend the first year of their child's life at home with their kid, which they wouldn't have got to do, because otherwise they would have been back at you know, doing day jobs. So the whole structure of society is set up to favor the current system, which is grossly inequitable in terms of the approach of gender in the workplace. And I think fundamentally that boils down to child rearing, and that the excuse of the biology is one itself away. I don't think that's really a viable excuse anymore.
Yeah, wow. I mean, you've been so comprehensive. A lot of the things you've said do remind me of what was happening in the Riot Girl movement, and how some of that has actually impacted upon the early 2000s band. Especially Paramore had a song to do with internalized misogyny. I can't thank you enough for being part of this discussion, which has been just, I really want to watch it back right now, but I'm not going to do that. What I'm going to do is let you, writer-director Noomi Spook, talk about any particular project you're involved with at the moment before we wrap up.
Oh gosh. Yeah, so, oh man.
Just choose one. Yeah, I know you work on many things.
Think there isn't really anything that I'm doing. So, so I am I am the founder of a heavy metal exercise dance class, which happens a few days a week. And yeah, so watch this space, because in the next few months, so at the moment it's on a private Facebook group, which was a mistake. I need to like move it over to a public group so that people can find it and join, without me needing to be Facebook friends with them first. But if anyone is interested in joining the group and likes the sound of doing some heavy metal exercise classes, then feel free to message me on Facebook, and I can add you to the group. But yeah, I will be kind of transposing that over to a public group that's searchable in the next couple of months. And yeah, so that's something that I've been doing in lockdown, and it'd be nice to get some more metalheads who are interested in having a, you know, tackling the physical and mental health challenges of a pandemic through moshing around like an idiot in your living room.
Well, that's the thing. I can personally attest to having a lot of fun in like the 3 or so sessions that I attended. But I became a gradual wuss, and now I'm a happy cyber cheerleader to continue to be part of that group and to like pitch and say, hey, keep going. But yeah, by all means, this has been fantastic. And I just want to thank you again for just giving so much heart and soul to every aspect of this conversation. So thank you.
My pleasure.
No worries. Thank you, Rantbox TV viewers, for watching. We do an episode every single Friday, posted before 12:30 GMT. If you like what was said here between myself and Noomi Spook, there should be links on the screen that will take you to another discussion that we had, which was about a film called I'm Thinking of Ending Things. And it was quite a fundamentally expressive experience. So do check that out if you've seen a Netflix film directed by Charlie Kaufman. But for now, I bid you goodbye. Have a lovely day or evening.